For most of the 20th century, American muscle didn't just dominate the road, it dominated the imagination. 8 cylinders weren't a technical choice, they were a statement. Power was supposed to be excessive, inefficient, and unmistakably loud. Detroit didn't just build engines, it built identity. If a car shook the pavement and drank fuel without apology, it belonged. And because of that certainty, no one was watching for a threat that didn't behave like one. Across the Pacific, Japan had built its reputation on the opposite philosophy: precision over excess, efficiency over emotion, small engines that lasted forever, cars that started every morning and asked for nothing in return. To American enthusiasts, that made Japanese manufacturers respectable, but irrelevant to muscle culture. They simply didn't speak the same language, which is why what happened next went almost completely unnoticed. Inside Japan's engineering departments, a quiet question began to form. Not a challenge, not a declaration of war, a curiosity. What if muscle wasn't cultural at all? What if it was mechanical? What if the things America celebrated, the torque, the proportions, the simplicity, could be rebuilt with discipline instead of chaos? There were no press releases, no bold claims, no attempt to provoke Detroit. Just engineers experimenting with an idea they weren't supposed to understand. A car began taking shape that followed American rules, but rejected American habits. It didn't announce itself, it didn't ask for attention. And that was the problem, because while Detroit was busy defending its throne, something unfamiliar was growing just outside its field of vision. Something powerful enough to matter and quiet enough to be ignored. By every rule that existed at the time, Japan simply wasn't supposed to be here. After the war, Japan rebuilt its auto industry around survival, not spectacle. Materials were scarce, fuel was expensive, reliability wasn't a selling point, it was a necessity. Engines were designed to last, not impress. Cars were judged by how little they wasted, not how much they consumed. This wasn't a culture chasing dominance, it was a culture chasing efficiency. Muscle, on the other hand, was built on excess. In America, big engines weren't justified, they were celebrated. Emissions laws were something to push against, not design around. Fuel economy was an afterthought. Muscle cars existed because America could afford to ignore consequences. They were loud because they could be, inefficient because no one cared. Their appeal wasn't logic, it was attitude. From Detroit's point of view, that attitude couldn't be copied. Japanese manufacturers were seen as engineers, not romantics. They understood tolerances and longevity, not rebellion. To American executives and enthusiasts alike, Japan might have been capable of building cars, but muscle required something deeper. A cultural instinct, a willingness to waste fuel, break parts, and rebuild without apology. That belief became a form of armor. Detroit assumed muscle cars were untouchable because they weren't rational products. They were emotional ones, and emotion, they believed, couldn't be engineered by outsiders who valued restraint over chaos. Which is why Japan's continued interest made no sense. Why would an industry built on discipline chase a segment defined by irresponsibility? Why pursue an idea so disconnected from its own identity? Those questions were never answered publicly. But behind closed doors, they didn't stop Japan from pushing forward. Because somewhere inside that contradiction was a suspicion Detroit never considered. Maybe muscle wasn't about excess at all. Maybe it was just another problem waiting to be solved. What Japan was building was never meant to be a headline. There was no launch campaign designed to provoke Detroit. No dramatic declaration that muscle had been reinvented. Inside the company, this project lived quietly, treated less like a product and more like a question. Engineers weren't chasing dominance, they were chasing understanding. They started by stripping muscle cars down to their fundamentals: rear-wheel drive, real displacement, torque that arrived low and stayed consistent. Long hoods, wide stances, proportions that communicated power before the engine ever turned over. These weren't design cues, they were functional truths. And once those truths were isolated, Japan did what it always did best. It refined them. The goal wasn't to outshout American muscle, but to see what happened when discipline was applied to something historically chaotic. Tolerances were tighter. Cooling was over-engineered. Components were designed to survive sustained abuse instead of short bursts of glory. Where American muscle accepted failure as part of the experience, this car was built to endure it. That difference mattered, because this wasn't imitation, it was translation. American muscle rewritten through a Japanese engineering lens. The soul wasn't borrowed, it was decoded. Engineers weren't asking how to copy the sound or the image. They were asking why the formula worked at all, and which parts of it were unnecessary. The result was something unfamiliar. A muscle car that didn't feel fragile. Power that didn't demand sacrifice. A machine that followed American rules without inheriting American bad habits. It didn't beg for attention. It didn't punish its owner for using it. And that raised a dangerous question. If muscle could exist without the chaos, what would happen when this car finally met the real world? Detroit didn't notice all at once. It noticed in fragments. A test result here, a comparison there. Quiet conversations between engineers who had no reason to exaggerate. At first, the Japanese car was treated like an oddity. Interesting but irrelevant. It wasn't louder, it wasn't faster in a straight line. It didn't wear the visual aggression Detroit had spent decades perfecting. On the surface, it didn't look like a threat. But discomfort doesn't come from what's obvious. It comes from what refuses to fail. When the numbers were compared more closely, the differences became harder to dismiss. The Japanese car delivered its power the same way, every time. Heat didn't unravel it. Hard use didn't loosen it. Where American muscle often demanded constant attention, tuning, rebuilding, forgiving its flaws, this car simply kept going. It made nearly the same promises, but unlike Detroit's machines, it kept them. That consistency was unsettling. Detroit had always competed on spectacle, big horsepower figures, aggressive marketing. The understanding that muscle cars were emotional purchases, not logical ones. Reliability was nice, but not essential. Buyers expected drama, sometimes even failure, as part of the experience. This car didn't play that game. It wasn't trying to steal attention. It was quietly removing excuses. Engineers began to realize that speed alone wasn't the metric that mattered anymore. Longevity was becoming performance. Build quality was becoming credibility. And that shift threatened something deeper than sales. It threatened identity. Because if muscle could be powerful and disciplined, then Detroit's long-standing weaknesses were no longer charming quirks. They were liabilities. Still, there was no panic, no emergency response, just a growing awareness that something uncomfortable had entered the conversation. A car that didn't dominate headlines, but refused to collapse under scrutiny. And that raised a question Detroit wasn't ready to answer. If this Japanese muscle car was truly this solid, why wasn't it everywhere? This was the moment the experiment stopped being theoretical.
Years of quiet refinement finally converged into a version of the car that no longer felt like a question mark. The engineering had matured. The compromises had been resolved. What remained was a machine that delivered exactly what muscle cars promised, without the familiar penalties that usually came with them. The power was there, but it arrived with control instead of chaos. Torque didn't spike and fade. It stayed usable, predictable, repeatable. The drivetrain felt settled, confident, as if it had been designed to live at the edge, rather than visit it briefly. Nothing rattled, nothing overheated, nothing asked to be forgiven. This was the contradiction made real. By every cultural rule, this car shouldn't have worked. Muscle was supposed to be temperamental, excessive, a little irresponsible. Yet here was a machine built with Japanese restraint that still delivered American excess, only without the drama. It didn't demand constant rebuilding to feel alive. It didn't trade longevity for excitement. It simply performed, day after day, under conditions that would slowly unravel many of its American counterparts. And that's what embarrassed assumptions. Because this wasn't a fluke. It wasn't a lucky configuration or a temporary high point. It was proof that muscle had never been mystical. It had never required a specific nationality or attitude. Strip away the mythology, and what remained was engineering. Solvable, repeatable, improvable. For those who experienced this version of the car, disbelief gave way to respect. Not the loud, emotional kind, but the quiet kind, reserved for things that work better than expected and refuse to explain themselves. At its peak, the car didn't just challenge Detroit's dominance, it challenged the story Detroit told itself. And once that realization set in, the outcome was inevitable, because history doesn't reward the most disciplined machine. It rewards the machine people choose to remember. By any rational measure, the car had succeeded. It proved its engineering. It delivered the performance it promised. It survived the abuse muscle cars were famous for enduring and often failing. But history isn't written by rational measures. It's written by stories. And this car arrived in the wrong one.
Muscle car culture was built on mythology, on burnouts and breakdowns, on the idea that power should feel dangerous even when it was inefficient or unreliable. Buyers didn't just want speed, they wanted drama. They wanted flaws they could forgive, engines they could complain about, and reputations built as much on legend as reality. The Japanese muscle car offered none of that. It was too calm, too consistent, too unwilling to self-destruct. Where American muscle wore its weaknesses like scars of honor, this car refused to develop them. And that honesty worked against it. It didn't give enthusiasts a narrative to romanticize. It didn't make excuses. It didn't beg to be rebuilt into something better. Branding only widened the gap. Japan's reputation for sensible cars followed it everywhere, no matter how much power it produced. To muscle buyers, the badge didn't signal rebellion, it signaled responsibility. Detroit understood this. It survived by selling image, not perfection. Even when outmatched on paper, it remained unmatched in mythology. So the car didn't fail, it simply faded. Not because it wasn't good enough, but because it asked the wrong audience to care. It tried to replace myth with logic in a market that thrived on contradiction. And yet, that raises the question Detroit hoped no one would ask. If the car didn't become a legend, did it still change everything anyway? The Japanese muscle car didn't end an era, it reshaped one. Detroit never publicly acknowledged its influence, but the shift was impossible to miss. Reliability quietly became a talking point. Build quality stopped being an afterthought. Engineering discipline, once dismissed as unnecessary, began to creep into designs that had previously relied on attitude alone. Muscle didn't get smaller or quieter, it got smarter. That change didn't happen overnight, and it didn't come with an apology. It happened the way uncomfortable truths usually do, indirectly, through incremental improvements, through internal conversations, through competitors adjusting standards they once claimed didn't matter. The Japanese car didn't win by outselling or outshouting. It won by existing, by proving that power and discipline weren't opposites, that excess didn't have to mean waste, that durability could coexist with excitement without diluting it. In that sense, it never needed to become a legend. Legends dominate headlines. Influence rewrites rules. Today, muscle cars are still loud, still aggressive, still unapologetic. But they're also expected to work, to last, to justify themselves beyond mythology. And that expectation didn't come from within Detroit, it was imposed from outside. The irony is quiet and permanent. A car that history barely remembers helped force an entire industry to grow up, not by erasing identity, but by proving it wasn't as fragile as everyone assumed. Because real dominance isn't about winning the war, it's about changing the battlefield and leaving without asking for credit.